Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Tweed's Talks. This is a series of online webinars that we sponsor here at Long Island University at the Roosevelt School. I'm the chairman of the Roosevelt School. I'm also a university professor at LIU, and I am the great-grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. There is an organization called the Society of Presidential Descendants, which we founded about 7 or 8 years ago. And so we draw on this series. We have at least two different kinds of events. One is what this will be, which is discussing with a presidential descendant that his or her views about being a presidential descendant, about their ancestor, what should be remembered and not remembered, what is remembered wrong, those kinds of things. I think we have a very interesting series. So let's get to today. Our guest today, he is a presidential descendant. His name is Birch Taylor. He's not, however, the descendant of a president you might think from his name. He's actually a descendant of Rutherford B. Hayes. And I'll let him introduce himself a little bit here.
Well, thank you, Tweed. It's a great opportunity to discuss my great-great-grandfather. I'm Birchard Taylor. I go by Birch. And Birchard is the middle name of Rutherford B. Hayes, which is a fact that very few people know. I was actually very thankful to get that name because, being unusual, I often get the question, tell me about your name. And that opens up the door for me to discuss a little bit about the great man that Rutherford B. Hayes was.
So I think you're all going to be surprised about what an extraordinary man he was, and you'll learn as we're going forth. I think you're really going to learn something. He's a forgotten president. Those presidents between Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, McKinley, were more or less forgotten, and totally unfairly. And I think you'll learn more about that today as we go through this. So Birch and I will just have a discussion. So, and you're sort of listening in, which we like. So tell me a little about your ancestor, Birch. What about his background? Where was he brought up? His family, his schools, those sorts of things.
Well, let me first start with his parents, and they were both Vermonters. His father, Rutherford Ezekiel Hayes, and his mother, Sophia Birchard, met and were married in Vermont. They had 2 children before they had Rutherford, Lorenzo and Fanny. And upon the death of Sophia's parents, they adopted Sophia's brother, Sardis Birchard. And why that's important is because when they moved to Ohio in 1817, they were basically moving to the wild, wild west in Delaware, Ohio. And upon Sophia getting pregnant, unfortunately, Rutherford Ezekiel, his father, passed away before he could be born, either from something like yellow fever or typhoid or one of the many illnesses that were present at that day and age. At that time, Sardis was a young man, about 21. He had learned the merchant trades from Rutherford Ezekiel, and he became the man of the family and did a very good job supporting the family as merchant. The Indians called him the white man you could trust. He also made a very good real estate investments and was able to later fund Rutherford's education through Kenyon College, in which Rutherford became the valedictorian, and later Harvard University. After graduating from Harvard,
Law school, right?
Harvard Law School, yes, that's correct. And after graduating from Harvard, Rutherford went back to Ohio, started a law practice in Northwest Ohio, but then moved to Cincinnati to a much more lucrative market, became a very successful lawyer, and even presenting cases at a very early age to the Ohio Supreme Court, winning cases for the Underground Railroad and doing work like that pro bono. He got a name for himself. He was elected city solicitor in that work pretty much before the age of 25 or 26. He was, in that late 20s range, known as a very successful lawyer. In fact, one of his opponents at the Ohio Supreme Court, who lost to him, said, "This man will someday make his mark on Ohio." It was.
Let's stop there. We'll get into the others as we go along. Give us a little snapshot of what kind of a guy was he, do you think?
So I would describe Rutherford Hayes as a man who, if you want to tell a story, he really has a story. It's about love, it's about duty, it's about reform, And it's about enduring change is the story of Rutherford Hayes. And we'll learn more about that as we go along, why I kind of categorize everything into those four main blocks. Because he really lived by some of those, enduring things. He was an ardent believer of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and something called the Northwest Ordinance, which comes from 1787. And the Northwest Ordinance talked mostly about education, and that if you want to have universal suffrage, you need to have universal education. And so his belief for public education that could educate the masses is a key theme throughout his life.
Tell us a little about his wife and his relationship, their relationship, which I think is absolutely marvelous.
So Lucy, so I love this story I came across. In fact, while I was researching it for this thing, Lucy and Rutherford met because I guess somehow their mothers knew each other, and they had them meet up at the Sulphur Springs in Delaware, Ohio. Lucy was 16, Rutherford was 25. They waited to get married for a couple of reasons. One, Rutherford, wanted to wait for her to be of age, and two, he wanted to make sure he had the ability to support the family. But the story about Lucy is she was not looking for a husband to save her. She was looking for a partner to save the soul of the nation. And likewise, I think Rutherford was looking for a partner on his journey, not for someone to be his shadow wife. And so the two were a perfect match. They had what I call a love affair that only death could separate.
Tell us about her schooling.
Well, so that's the next part of that Lucy story is she met Rutherford at the age of 16, and after meeting him fairly shortly after, she went to, she fought to get admitted to Ohio Wesleyan College in Cincinnati. Women at that time in the 1840s did not go to college, were not expected to go to college, and it was a rarity that they would. She not only got into Wesleyan University, but she graduated in 3 years at the age of 19. And we'll talk more about Lucy as we get into a Civil War battle. That's a great story about Lucy coming up.
Okay, well, we'll get to that. Now let's go back to Rutherford B. Hayes as a politician. So his first elected of office was it state? He
was a city solicitor. He was elected the city solicitor in the town of Cincinnati. And from that position, he, that was late 1850s. And then the Lincoln campaign came through Cincinnati. He pretty much was part of the organization of that campaign, got to meet Abraham Lincoln, was all bought into Lincoln's promises and Lincoln's agenda, helped Lincoln get elected, via his work in Ohio.
So he was a Whig that turned into a Republican.
He was a Whig, and he was a reluctant Republican. He didn't join the Republican Party right away, but the Whigs basically fell apart. And when the Republican Party emerged, it was mostly made up of Republicans, but there were a lot of disenfranchised Democrats that also joined that party.
So here he is. He's got a political position. Lincoln takes the White House, and the war starts. Then what happens?
Well, Rutherford Hayes said, "I am supportive of this war." Lucy was completely supportive of her husband's decision. He immediately enlisted, and Governor Dennison of Ohio commissioned the Ohio 23rd Regiment with Hayes as a leader, as a major in the Army, enlisted major. And so he initially, without second thoughts, joined the war. Now, the interesting thing about that is, even before he got into war, there was a big brouhaha, so to speak, in the training camps, because when the weapons were delivered, they were the old musket style, basically Revolutionary era muskets. And they felt they'd been promised a new musket, or the new technology, which had rifling technologies and which were much more accurate. Well, when most of the troops said, "Well, we're quitting because we're not going to do this," and Scammon, the colonel above Hayes, said, "Well, we're going to put you all in jail and whatever," because that was the West Point way of doing things, right? Well, I believe Hayes was the perfect blend of interpreting and understanding what West Point military theory is and communicating that to the untrained militia of the time that he was to lead. He gave examples of like, well, our forefathers won this country on that technology. Did they give up and did they quit? And this is a good cause. And basically, the troops said bully for Hayes, and they got behind him. And he was able to be the bridge between the troops and scamming the West Point colonel that led them through most of the war. So he was a bridge leader, and I think he's one of the few that rose to the ranks as an enlisted man from major to a major general.
So tell us a little about as the war progressed here. What kind of a career did he have?
So the Ohio 23rd was first sent to the Western Virginia. It was not West Virginia at the time, and the primary reason for having regiments there was to preserve that territory for the Union. It was a Union leaning area of the country, and if they could preserve that, in fact, a couple of years into the Civil War, it did become a state, West Virginia, a Union state, and that was a primary purpose of going to West Virginia. However, they did fight in some major battles from, in West Virginia, Carnifax Ferry, which basically is what preserved the territory for West Virginia, to Cloyd's Mountain, Winchester, and then a precursor. They were in Antietam too, the Ohio 23rd, but the battle before Antietam, 3 days before, was called South Mountain. And Hayes was significantly wounded in South Mountain, through and through on his left arm, in which telegrams didn't get to Lucy, but word of mouth communicated to Lucy that he was possibly, he was wounded, maybe, they didn't know where he was, maybe dead, so forth. Lucy immediately traveled to the battlegrounds in search of her husband. She did find him in Middletown, Ohio, recuperating. But she also visited the troops frequently, and this was one of those times. And this is a great story how she went to the surgeon's area, and they had been doing amputations for two days, and she showed up with a bucket of water to help out, standing on the bloodied floors, and it was a hot day in September, and the surgeon said to her, "Ma'am, this is not a parlor. This is basically a slaughterhouse." And to which Lucy replied, "I am not here for the parlor. I am here for my voice." and that's a great picture of Lucy. She visited the battlefields often because she was an officer's wife and allowed to do so, and she chose to do so. She mended the soldiers' clothes. She tended their wounds. She held their hands while they were dying, and she sent many final letters home to their parents. So I remember Lucy as the Eleanor of the Civil War, and she didn't get the press because she wasn't First Lady at the time, but she certainly deserves the same kind of recognition that Eleanor did for her time visiting the troops in World War II.
And that's amazing. Yeah, really pretty rare, I suppose. Not many wives did that. Was Grant in Hayes's line of command, chain of command? Did they know each other? Or?
But they knew each other, and Grant. There's, if you read his biography, Grant said he was an able, capable, and courageous soldier. I think some of the quotes about Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes fought first under Rosecrans as a general. As I mentioned, he was under Scammon for a while. In the end, he was in the Shenandoah campaign under General Sheridan's command. So he didn't directly report to Grant, but Grant certainly knew of him.
And that wasn't the only future president he was involved with.
Well, so in his Civil War experience, a young private signed up at the same time he did, assigned to the 23rd. The young private's name was William McKinley. And during the Civil War years, the two of them developed a lifelong mentorship or a relationship. William McKinley was recognized by Hayes as someone with a lot of talent. Hayes promoted him through the ranks, quartermaster, eventually to become major. McKinley will describe Hayes as, his lifelong mentor, and many historians say that Hayes was the man that McKinley admired most during his lifetime. Often visiting the White House during Hayes's term in the White House, consulting Hayes on things like tariff policy, and even getting into politics and running. So Hayes was a very important person in McKinley's life. I think, McKinley followed a lot of Hayes's doctrine for monetary policy and other things.
It's really rather remarkable that kind of this small group of people all knew each other. Well, tell us some more about as the war progressed. Then what happened with McKinley?
Well,
I'm sorry, with
as the war, yeah, that's right. As we're getting near the end of the war, Hayes's notoriety in Ohio became known as kind of an Ohio war hero. He was nominated to run for Congress while he was still fighting in 1864. And the famous quote is, Hayes said, "Any man who would leave his duties to save the Union, to go campaign for office ought to be scalped." So he didn't campaign. It turned out that was probably played pretty well in Ohio, and he unseated an incumbent congressman for Congress in 1864. He served a couple terms in Congress before he then ran for governor.
So he's elected while he's still an officer. Is the war still going on when he's elected?
He is elected, and in fact, he didn't really take his seat in Congress until after the war was over. So he was several months late to Congress, and I guess for maybe about a week he was serving under Lincoln, but most of the time he served under Andrew Johnson in Congress.
I see. And so as he went into Congress, what were his principal issues? What did he want to achieve as a congressman, do you think?
Well, as a congressman, he was he was very much for the same principles he was his whole life. The big issue of the times was the reconstruction and the readmittance of the states to the Union. And Lincoln had set out a plan which was fairly forgiving, but the president at the time, Andrew Johnson, was making it even more forgiving, and his voting record was pretty much against Andrew Johnson's more forgiving, allowing states to enter the Union without, maintaining, the voting suffrage for the new free men of the country. So that's what he was fighting for most of the time he was in Congress.
He had been a longtime supporter. It seemed like it was in his grain that for racial justice, starting as a lawyer. You mentioned, I think, briefly that some of his major cases involved freemen or slaves who were.
Yes, they absolutely were. And I think he got a lot of that from Lucy. Lucy had Lucy grew up in a very abolitionist family. And so that was one of the things Lucy said when she said, "I'm not looking for a husband to save me. I'm looking for a husband to be my partner." And why she chose Rutherford was he was a man that was willing to listen to her on her anti-slavery views, on her temperance views and other things. Not always agreeing with her, but definitely wanted to listen to her. And therefore, I think he was greatly influenced by Lucy on the abolitionist thing. Also, his time at Harvard, the abolitionist movement was really, really strong in New England at that time. So getting his law degree in Harvard probably cemented some of those feelings. So
he's a congressman. Why does he leave? What happened?
Well, he left to go run for governor of Ohio.
So he wasn't voted out. I thought he lost.
No, there's two accounts. I've seen it where he lost an election, and then I saw another one where he resigned to go run for governor. So I'm a little unclear on that.
All right. So now he's running for governor. What happens then?
Well, he runs for governor and he is elected for governor. It's a very narrow election. He wins the vote by like 1%. And in his first term of governor, Ohio was kind of a 50-50 state at the time. And while he got elected as a Republican governor, the legislature was still Democratic. So in his first term, Ohio failed to ratify like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. They in the same election he got elected, they did not vote for ratification. So that was one of his major goals. And his first term was a little disappointing in his eyes because of the political nature. Now, he must have done a pretty good job in the first term because he got elected by a bigger majority in the second term and got a Republican legislature in the second term as well. And in going with that, they did ratify all those amendments to the the Constitution, and that's one of his significant achievements that he says I'm very, very proud of. But the other significant achievement in his second term was the Ohio legislature had basically dropped the ball on the land grant issue for colleges. And so Ohio State was about to miss an opportunity to have a land grant college. The battle, and so he brought up that issue and told the legislature, we're going to have a land grant college. Ohio University in Athens and Miami University down near Cincinnati said they wanted the land grant. And he said, no, we're going to have a land grant college for all Ohioans. We want to make this affordable so that everybody's economic boats can be floated. And so he won that battle, and the Ohio Agriculture and Mechanical College came into existence in his second term. You may notice I'm wearing an Ohio State shirt, and that is the name of that college today, the Ohio State University.
And continue, before we go back to his presidency, continue his relationship with Ohio State later on.
Well, so post-presidency, that university or that college was 24 graduates the first year. By the time he had been finished his presidency, it was financially in trouble. And so he came back, and one of his causes post-presidency was he joined the board of trustees for the Ohio Agricultural Mechanical College, and he fought for the financial stability of that college at the legislature and won that stability and became president of the board of trustees before he passed away. So Ohio State has
How many students then? How many students at the second round?
I do not know the statistic on that number, but I do know that it's over 10,000 students today.
Yeah, and I think it's grown quite a bit by then. Yeah, very interesting. Education was based for him on what the founders felt was essential for what they called virtual voter, a virtuous voter. In other words, an educated and knowledgeable voter. And he really worked on that, didn't he? Was it also in other levels of schooling, or was it all focused on graduate, college education?
Oh, let me talk. Yeah. So the other areas, I'll get into this in a minute, but one more statistic about Ohio State. So today, the 10,000 graduates, about 2,000 are first-time graduates of their family, which would be the total vision for Rutherford B. Hayes, is the number of graduates that are rising to a level where they're improving the economic lot of their family. Now, we also spent a lot of time post-presidency, not only in prison reform, but he was on the board of the Peabody Fund and the Slater Fund, which were scholarship funds for freemen. And he wrote volumes and volumes of books on how the freemen could learn skills and trades and get educated so that they could be productive in society. Because basically they didn't have many skills other than picking cotton or other crops. And so it's important that they get an education.
We'll get into more of this a little later. So let's go. He was out as governor for a while, and then he was reelected for a third term, correct?
Well, so he retired after 2 terms of being governor, retired to Spiegel Grove in Fremont, Ohio, where his uncle had a homestead. And a few years later, he was the 29th governor, but then he became like the 32nd governor. So a few governors in between. And William Allen was governor at the time, and the Republicans had no candidate to go against William Allen. So they knocked on his door and said, will you run for governor? We need someone that can be competitive against the Democratic governor. At first he said, no, I refuse. And after repeated attempts, another theme of his is duty. He relinquished and said, okay, I guess it's my duty. I'll give it a shot. And this was in the election of 1875. So he beat a popular governor, William Allen, to become the first third-term governor of Ohio in 1876.
One of the things that's extraordinary about him, and this was an example of it, unlike any politicians later, he was really a reluctant politician. He really didn't want, and it was felt, it wasn't a tactic. He really didn't want to run. He found it, difficult, didn't want to do it, but he had a sense of duty. Could you comment on that?
Well, yeah, sure. I think he did not run for glory. He did not run for fame. He did not run for monetary gain. He ran to serve the country. And he felt it was his duty, which is part of why I put duty as one of the themes of Rutherford B. Hayes.
Yeah, I agree. It's extraordinary when you read about over and over again. I'd like to go home and relax for a change, and all right, I got to do it. I'll do it, and he did it. So let's talk about he's governor now, and it's presidential time. So
So
what
the fact that he won that election for governor for the third term, without that, he would not have been in the conversation for the Republicans. So the Republicans grants on the end of his second term. There's that Washington precedence that 2 terms is the max, although it's not law by that time. And plus there were a number of things going on in the Republican Party, a number of scandals, from the whiskey scandal to the Great Panic of 1873, the failure of the Jay Cooke Bank and the railroad expansion. The country was in a depression. Democrats had won the majority in Congress, and the Republicans felt that they needed a candidate that represented honesty and integrity. And because the mood of the country was they're tired of these scandals that are going on in the country.
and who were his competitors for the Republican nomination?
Those competitors was Blaine was in first place in the convention. Conkling, the most powerful senator from the state of New York, controlling the New York Customs House, was in the running. There was also Benjamin Bristow, who was the Treasury Secretary for President Grant. He's the one that uncovered the whiskey ring, which implicated the vice president, or actually I think it was the vice president was involved in that scandal, or the Credit Mobilier scandal. So there was a lot of people around Grant that were doing things that weren't so great. But Bristow was, because he uncovered that, was considered to be an honest guy.
So he had an honest guy, and then generally Blaine and Coughlin were considered on the other side of the heap.
But Conkling was the master of the spoil system. We can talk about that.
Yeah,
And what kind of graft and corruption was going on with the spoil system. And Blaine was he was Speaker of the House at the time, and Blaine was supposedly involved in the Credit Mobilier scandal, which had to do with a false company set up, construction company for the railroads, and people skimming off $44 million. And he supposedly got his money back on the stock he owned, and but he was never proved. So nothing ever happened to him, except it was a under the radar scandal that probably prevented Blaine, who was in first place on the first ballot.
Yeah, and so remarkably, the Republican Party, recognizing that they couldn't win with somebody whose character was tarnished, chose him. I think it's a remarkable thing.
Well, yeah. So the other thing that contributed to that is Blaine and Conkling didn't like each other. So between the two of them, had plenty of votes to win the nomination, but neither would give the other their votes. And similar to like Lincoln was everybody's second choice. By the 5th or 6th ballot, Hayes became everybody's second choice, and they threw their votes to Hayes in the convention. And as you know, there was no primary system back then, so it was state legislatures electing delegates, and delegates bargaining for each other's votes during a convention.
So he's the Republican nominee. Who are the Democrats putting up?
The Democrats put up a fellow named Samuel Tilden, and if you put their agendas side by side, you'd say there's not a lot of difference here. Both are for sound money. Both are reform candidates, and on and on and on. Very, very similar. Tilden was the governor of Ohio. He got his fame actually from, and no disrespect to you, Tweed, but he cleaned up the Tweed gang, who was in control of Tammany Hall and Democratic politics, and he put the boss in jail, and that's how he got his fame. So he was a reform candidate just like Rutherford B. Hayes. But the one separating difference, the Civil War. Hayes said, I'm fighting for the Union. And Sam said, here's your $300. I don't want to fight.
$300, by the way, I think people don't realize that was roughly equivalent to $10,000 today. It's a lot more than people realize. Well, yeah, you get asked about the Birch. I get asked about my first name, Tweed, and tarred with that brush. But in any case, so the two are running against each other. How did people campaign in those days? What happened? Where are we?
Well, the campaigns, I don't know that I followed his campaign a lot. I'm sure they were, he traveled, he gave speeches. The, the campaigns weren't media campaigns like they are today. I'm not sure you could get elected in today's. You got to be a media star to get elected today. It was a very, very close election. One thing it was not a mudslinging election. It's not like Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams, where they were really slinging mud at each other. I think they were very polite, running on their themes and, why they, you see a lot of buttons and banners and stuff like that, newspaper articles, their speeches. That was their method of campaigning.
And so it's election day. And what happens then?
Well, election day comes and the vote is indeterminate from an electoral college perspective. The election popular vote is credited to Tilden as having won the popular vote, but there are 3 or 4 states that are the electors, or 2 different ballots were submitted by the states, and as such, they were obviously 1 ballot for Hayes and 1 ballot for Tilden. Tilden was still 1 vote shy of an electoral college victory, and because of that, Congress formed a commission to decide the election, and in deciding the election, here I'm going to share. I'm not sharing the right screen, am I?
No, that seems to be.
Stop share. I'm going to share a screen that shows the election results. And that should be the screen, I think. Is that the right screen there? So you can see
yes, that's it.
So we got the 4 disputed states, and we've got Hayes and Tilden there. In the end, the Electoral Commission, really the state of Oregon, even though disputed, was clearly there was 1 elector that resigned, and then they tried to put someone up that was going to vote the wrong way. The state did vote for Hayes in Oregon, so they got that corrected pretty quickly. The other 3 states were Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, and there was clearly a lot of fraud in those states. That so much so that even the Electoral Commission, which ended up handing all the votes to Hayes, the Democrats immediately, when he became president, said that he committed fraud. They started a commission called the Potter Commission to prove that Hayes and the Republicans committed fraud. And that was something that backfired on them, because it did not prove any fraud for the Republicans and identified numerous situations of fraud for the Democrats. So
it's important to keep it. I think I want to remind everybody, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party of those days is more or less the mirror image in some senses of today. So,
the Republican Party, yes. So the Republican Party was made up of a number of different factions. There were the stalwarts, were people that like Grant and Conkling and Chester Arthur, and there were the progressives like Hayes and Lincoln and others. There were the abolitionists, which basically had won their battle with the Civil War being fought, and there were the prohibitionists, which surprisingly were about 20% of the party. And we'll probably have a discussion on that later on today.
Yeah. So, if Hayes is remembered for anything vaguely by people, there's kind of a taint, which you tell me whether you think it's deserved or not, is that there was corruption in the process of dealing with those 4 states, and that he somehow was illegitimately chosen by corruption.
So this commission, it was, many people theorized that there was a great compromise, that deal made with the commission so that those states would be afforded to Hayes. There is absolutely no evidence of such a compromise. We've even had conventions at the Hayes Presidential Center, which brought historians together to investigate this. And the conclusion is that there was no great compromise.
Tell us what the compromise is supposed to have been.
The compromise was supposed to have been, we will certify this election for Hayes, if he agrees to, take the troops out of the South, which he did. He did take the troops out of the South. At that point, there were federal troops still occupying two states, Louisiana and South Carolina. Now, you got to put that in perspective, because at the end of the Civil War, there were federal troops in hundreds and hundreds of cities at that time. And from Andrew Johnson to the Grant administrations, all but two locations, they had been removed. Reconstruction, whether you agree with the process and whether it was strict or not, was basically over with when Hayes took office. He removed those final two tropes. He gets the label, he ended Reconstruction, and it may have had a negative effect on the civil rights of many Americans for many years. But the truth is that, in my belief, that Reconstruction was basically over before he took office.
And, the idea that we were occupying, the Union was occupying the South, don't get the idea that there were thousands of troops there. In fact,
There was about 1,000 troops. Yeah, about
in
1,000.
one state, there was only 11, if I
Right.
remember correctly.
It wasn't much.
So it's not much of a deal. It was more what it symbolized than what had actually happened. Well, anyway, so it's resolved. He's become president now, or he's about to become president. He's approaching the White House. What do you think he wanted to use his presidency for?
Well, he campaigned on reform, ending the spoil system, which today is called the swamp, right? And the spoil system was a system of patronage where there were a lot of federal appointments. It usually took a year or two for presidents to make all those appointments, and they were lucrative jobs. You had to give up 7% of your salary to the reelection campaigns of many people. And you basically, you didn't have to have any qualifications. So he wanted a system of meritocracy. He didn't have to change, people every time there was administrative change. And his target was the U.S. or the New York Customs House, because that was the center of the spoil system. 70% of the U.S. revenue came through tariffs in the U.S. New York Customs House, because at that time there were no income taxes. The head of that Customs House was none other than Chester Arthur, and his supporter was Roscoe Conkling. And
We've heard those names before.
Roscoe Conkling had all this power because of controlling the revenue of the United States government. All Republicans had to come to Roscoe if they wanted to get elected to anything, because campaign funding and a lot of stuff went through Roscoe. And it was this whole power of the country at that time resided more with senatorial courtesy than it did with the president himself. And Hayes, that wasn't his campaign theme, but that turned out to be one of his accomplishments, in my view, was fighting that senatorial courtesy.
And we're talking in today's dollars of hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps, in corruption. I mean, this was a big deal. And the ability to do anything about it didn't really totally come to conclusion until 30, 40 years later. But he sure made a start, didn't he? What were some of his... Go ahead.
So just to elaborate on that point, so the Customs House salary was the same as the president's, $50,000 a year, and I'm sure that Chester Arthur was getting another 50 grand on top of that through, skimming off the Customs House.
And the multiple is something like 30, so that you'd have to multiply it by 30 to get today's dollars, I believe, something like that.
Yeah, the GDP of the country was about $2,500 per person back then. So a presidential salary actually at $50,000 was richer then than it is today. And I'm sure people like Chester Arthur were making much more money as the head of the Customs House than when he finally became president. And another interesting point, Tweed, is while he's trying to clean up the Customs House, he did fire Chester Arthur. It took him a year or more to do so. His first attempt was blocked by none other than Roscoe Conkling, and his nominee for that position was the father of Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt Sr.
Yes. TR always, his father died shortly thereafter, and TR thought that perhaps it was from a broken heart, maybe on that. But anyway, that's another story. What else did he achieve as president?
Well, he entered the presidency under economic distress. So the Panic of 1873, which was actually, 4 years before he took office, was a Great Depression. It was the failure of Jay Cooke and the railroad expansion. It was wages were going down. In fact, it wasn't only a few months after he took the oath of office that there was a great railroad strike, first strike that involved multiple states. And it was because the railroads were cutting wages for the third time in a single year, and the workers were fed up. So that was, there were some state militia that killed people. He put federal troops in to protect federal property because they were burning trains and train stations and everything else. He recognized the value of trains, which was like today's internet, to keep things running. And things were settled within 50 days, which was very important because it didn't turn into some of the, there was a lot of revolution going on in Europe and other places at that time. So he settled the country down. He was a big proponent of sound money. He fought against greenbacks and silverbacks. He lost the battle with the Bland Silver Act, but was able to limit its inflationary aspects. And he paid down the debt substantially during his term from the Civil War, such that he was able to back greenbacks with dollars. Now, the importance of that was that creditors would then lend money. So you think today, going back to a dollar standard would probably hurt our economy. But back then, we were a debtor nation. We were not the leader in the world. We were second to England in terms of our economy. We were growing, but we needed creditors from around the world, and they wouldn't lend to us because we had this multiple monetary system, and there was not a lot of faith in the dollar. When he restored that faith and paid back greenbacks with dollars, he set us on the path towards the gold standard again. And interestingly enough, McKinley's the one that finally got us back on the gold standard. So he was the alpha, McKinley was the omega of the gold standard in those days. And I do believe that that was the reason the US currency eventually became the fiat currency of the world. But it also, in 1878, it still was a Democratic Congress. It was still an economy that was in bad straits, but by 1879, after making those decisions, we had a booming economy, and we were set up for another Republican victory in 1880 with James Garfield, and at that time, a Republican Congress was brought in. So I think his administration, if you want to measure it, is measured by the success of what he did with the economy and bringing back the faith to the Republican Party.
I think an interesting point here is that the adjustment of the money situation was to the benefit of lenders and the detriment, it could be argued, of debtors. And one of the reasons it was pushed against was there were a lot of people who were debtors. But I think in this case, it says something about Hayes's character, because he was a major debtor at the time. He owed a lot of money, and this was going to hurt him. But that he never gave a second thought, as far as I can tell, about that. He was interested in what was better for the country.
Well, that follows into his theme all along and what he campaigned on. He serves his party best, who serves his country best.
Yeah.
And he when he fought the spoils system and won, he was fighting against his own party. When he fought for the currency, he was fighting against the Democrats. So he wasn't picking sides. He was fighting for what was right for the country. And what's interesting, the spoils debate, the first civil service reform bill was passed under Arthur, who he had fired. It was also, the legislation was written by George Pendleton. George Pendleton was a Democrat from Ohio. George Pendleton ran against Hayes in one of those gubernatorial elections. So good ideas, the right ideas, eventually get to where they need to be.
Well, I think it's remarkable that he stood by his principles so much. We would like more like that. Now, let's go back to the other major player in the family, Lucy. So tell us about Lucy in the White House.
Well, we talked about Lucy and Lucy's character and her Civil War, visiting the troops, and she fought in the trenches, basically. She was definitely moved by all that. She went to the White House. She gets some bad raps. She's blamed for not serving alcohol in the White House. And
Lemonade Lucy, maybe?
Well, Lemonade Lucy, that term came about probably after the Hayeses had passed away, but certainly after they were in the White House. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't Lucy's decision. I'm sure she whispered in Rutherford's ear. Rutherford did have a state dinner early on that served wine, and he got a lot of flack from the prohibitionists. And because the prohibitionists were such a big influence on the party, he made the decision, and I'm sure Lucy concurred, that they would not serve alcohol in the White House. Now, at first, some of these society people snubbed their parties, but Lucy brought fun, laughter. She brought music. She brought poetry. She brought family values to the White House, and that was widely respected. And people came back to the functions, and that was an important part of politicking in those days. She's also the first one to hire a professional African-American musician to come play at the White House. So you can, those sorts of events really highlight the values of the Hayes family.
Were their how old were their kids when they were in the White House?
Oh, so their kids, I had to do some math on that tweet. I know they celebrated their 25th anniversary in the White House.
So the kids weren't little kids?
No, they weren't. They weren't little kids. I'm not sure. They might have had one or two of the younger ones living at the time with them, but it's not like the Lincoln years or the Kennedy years.
Or TR, by the way. Okay, and Lucy, let me ping you, the First Lady.
Yeah, so, we'll talk about that love affair of Rutherford and Lucy, because I think that's very, very important. We talked about how they both had the same values, but Rutherford began calling Lucy his First Lady from day one. When he was elected governor.
Day one is marriage, you're talking about.
Day one of his marriage, day one of his courtship. Lucy's my First Lady. The only thing he could have said that would be maybe stronger, but I think he meant it, was not only is Lucy my First Lady, but she's my only lady.
I want to interrupt.
Rasmus Conkling had a few affairs which are well known.
Yes. That hasn't gone out of style, has it? Anyway, I just want to interrupt the proceedings here for a moment. If you all have questions, we're not able to deal with them live, but if you go to the chat down at the bottom, it will tell you how to reach us, and you can send us questions. We'll answer them, and you'll have several options. So look at that, and later on I'll have a few more to say about this. Now, we're running out of time here, but
let me just finish up on Lucy, First Lady. So, sure. First Lady, his First Lady, she became the First Lady of Ohio. When he became president, that's the first time the press coined the term First Lady. So we can credit Lucy with it being First Lady. She also started the White House Easter egg roll from 1878.
Oh, wow. A remarkable pair. Let's look briefly. Now, President Carter is recognized generally as having the most brilliant post-presidential career. But I think, and we've mentioned some of this before, but I think that Hayes is right up there. Would you make a few comments about that?
Yeah, I think so. First of all, I don't want to diminish anything that Carter did in his post-presidency. Sure. He certainly had a great post-presidency. All the charitable things he did, what he represented, from facilitating things with other countries to Habitat for Humanity, they were certainly very, very great. As I mentioned before, Hayes, he came back to basically save the Ohio State University, and also to fight for a couple of things, the education of the freemen. And I mentioned briefly that he did a lot of prison reform as well. His prison reform work the conditions were pretty horrible. I'm not sure they're great today, but they were probably worse back then. He fought for the reform, but more importantly, he fought for education for people in the prison system, and pretty much for education to keep people out of the prison system. His belief was, if we can train people in skills that they can earn a living on, that they had a better chance of choosing a life that didn't involve crime. And so he fought for that, as well as for better conditions in the prisons.
It's one of the big fight. That was a big fight in those days. It's kind of an unfortunate history. I'll only mention the fact that the prisons themselves were vicious places, and the progressive thinking, the people who were, sort of trying to solve this problem, which had much to do with what was going on in England, and we followed the English, but was the best way to deal with them is to put them all in solitary confinement. And I don't know what Hayes's position on this, but that's what was done in the sort of model prisons in places in Pennsylvania, for example, which were a leader here. And it is, what could possibly go wrong? Well, you can imagine it was an awful solution. And so we had to overcome the progressive solution before, and this was all part of the big fight that was going on then. So I think you want to make any more comments about being a presidential descendant?
Well, it's actually just an honor to be a descendant of Hayes. I didn't grow up really thinking I was anything special. I had a pretty middle-class family. I realized later in life how special the values that were imparted on me were, which are a lot of what we talked about today, about education and so forth, and honesty and doing the right thing. And I've tried to pass them on to my daughters as well. But I think that's what's special about being presidential descendant is the foundation that I was given, not necessarily being known as the great-great-grandson of Rutherford B. Hayes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm kind of stuck with it because it sort of sticks out like a sore thumb, so it's a different story. But anyway, so let's begin to wrap up here. What are the two, in my mind, first of all, it's unfair that he's not remembered at all. And if he is remembered, it's for something that he shouldn't have been taken to task for, of the quote corrupt way he got into the presidency. What do you think are his two most important contributions his whole life?
Well, he will state that Ohio State University and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment by Ohio were his two greatest achievements. I think as president, his revival of the economy and setting the currency on a path to becoming a fiat currency are significant achievements. I also think getting the country's mindset on a more moral path and reforming of the spoils systems, which didn't happen until after he was out of office, was still a significant accomplishment during his presidency. And the third one, which was sort of unattended, but in the battle for the currency and also the battle for the spoils system, it's reclaiming power to the president for federal appointments versus Congress and the senators controlling all that. So restoring presidential power where it should be restored were his accomplishments.
I agree with you. I think and they're sort of generally kind of boring subjects to a lot of people, but they're extremely important, and he set us on the right course. I completely agree. If you could talk to him now, what would you ask him, or what would you talk about, or what would you want him to talk about?
Well, I'd probably ask him a little bit about his family because I'd like to know more about that.
Sure.
I'd like to know about some of those battles. I mean, I read a lot about, learning about Roscoe Conkling and Chester Arthur. There's actually a pretty interesting read called The Unexpected President on Chester Arthur, which is a really good read. But I'd like to understand how he won that battle with Conkling. And the Civil War years. I've read his diary, but it's, he's so optimistic in his diary during the Civil War, even when the Union is losing battle after battle. He was generally a very optimistic person. In fact, one of my favorite quotes from him is a quote that says, be on the sunny side of cold weather. Even the coldest of us has a sunny side if you can only find it.
Yeah, it was remarkable how positive he was, almost to the point of, caricature sometimes, maybe. Extraordinary man, an extraordinary man. Tell us, Theodore Roosevelt, I once wrote an article for something that said the 50 essential books about Theodore Roosevelt. Talk a little about Hayes's books.
Well, I think there's a couple of books. There's the comprehensive book by Harry Hogenboom, President and Warrior, I think it's called. There's a good book called
Hold it under your chin. Yeah, there we can see it.
100 Days in the
Yeah,
Life.
that's a good book.
It's an easy read. It's a very positive book. For a descendant, I like it a lot. And I learned that there's a brand new book written by the Hayes historian on staff from our library called Rutherford B. Hayes, A Life of Service and Honor. I haven't read that book yet, but I think it's
Oh, I think
it's
I'll
gonna
read it.
be, it's a shorter book, and I think it'll be a good read too.
Yeah, that I forget the exact title, but the 100, whatever it is, of Hayes, that's a great book. His approach is to basically pick 100 different letters and whatever else he was writing. It's a fascinating way of dealing with history and well worth reading, I think. So I put you on the spot here a little bit, but where would you rank him?
Well, so I'm not from Paraguay, but if I was from Paraguay, I'd rank him number one.
Tell us that. We didn't go into that.
Well, he helped settle the land dispute between Paraguay and Argentina after the Triple Alliance War, which was a very devastating war for Paraguay. About a third of the land of Paraguay is attributable to that settlement. And Paraguay thanks Rutherford B. Hayes for that. In fact, I met the Paraguayan ambassador at the anniversary of the museum a number of years ago, and he gave an impassioned speech, emotional speech, more than 120 or 30 years later, about how much Paraguay is indebted to Rutherford B. Hayes. So they rank him number one. Now, I can't rank him number one. I think, we got Lincoln and we've got Washington. And after that, I think the rankings of historians, you got to take everything in context, right? The context of the time. We just talked about everything that was going on during his presidency and before his presidency and all the issues. And none of that comes out when people rank presidents. He wasn't a war president. He didn't acquire massive amounts of land. He didn't do all the things that they put people high for. But for the reasons that we have talked about today, I would say he was the best leader for those times. He advocated for one presidential term, 6 years. Now we're down to 2 4-year terms. But he felt that he needed to have the power to do what he campaigned on. He who serves his party best, he serves his party best, who serves his country best. And he felt if he was always playing to a re-election, he could not do that.
Yeah, I think it's right. I think he was absolutely remarkable. By the way, had there been a Nobel Peace Prize, then he would have deserved for this conflict that nobody else has ever heard of. And I gather they named a province and a city after him.
Yeah, well, they named Villa Hayes, which is the largest province in Paraguay, for Rutherford B. Hayes.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I hope I've certainly learned something, and I hope others have. My bottom line on Rutherford B. Hayes is he's probably the most decent president we've ever had and is a perfect model for what a good politician should be. And that came to me as a complete surprise because I hadn't known anything about it before. Well, let's look on to our next sessions here. Our next session is on May 21st. We'll go back to interviewing authors, and I'm going to bring for you to meet Harold Holzer. Try to get that. I would get the Hayes and Holzer mixed up here. He wrote a book called The Presidents versus the Press, which is a fascinating book and very relevant to today. And he's a lively and interesting person to interview. So I hope that you will join us on May 21st, a Thursday. These will always be held at Thursday at noon. You can learn more at our website, the Roosevelt School website at LIU, and we'll have flyers eventually and so on. I'd really appreciate it if you enjoy these, that you would tell your friends, send them the flyer when it comes out electronically. You can reach me anytime you want, either at the university or my email address. Get a piece of paper here. My email address is tweedr@sprynet, or you can call me at 617-823-4488. So thank you all, and thank you specifically to Birch for this. I think it's a marvelous session. Thank you all. I look forward to seeing you next month.